hit it again?
Well, hello everyone. My name is Xochitl Hernandez. For those of you who read my bio, I am a opera singer currently at California State University Northridge. But in addition to being a vocal performance major and a musician, I am also a multimedia journalist. I am also Mexican American. I identify as Chicana or Latina. So I was always really curious about how I could combine my multiple passions around music and how I could combine music with multimedia journalism in order to serve others and affect social change. So the way I've done that is by creating Notes from Her, which, based on my research and this entire project that I created based off of my imagination, it would, I argue, is the future of opera's new media accessibility and experience. So what is Notes from Her? Well, it is a podcast that encourages women and others to embrace their inner multicultural melody. Now that means a few different things, but first I want to get into some statistics to consider as to what inspired this project and my own personal experience as well. As someone who is a Latina who did not grow up with classical music or classical music education, I entered the classical music world as an 18-year-old at my university and found that classical music and opera still did not have a lot of women that looked like me in leadership positions. It was very lonely. I almost didn't want to do this for a time being. But with the help of many mentors and just basically pushing forward, I decided, to kind of like be that person that could inspire that change. Now we do so well with incorporating so much more representation and diversity on our main stage, as well as, LA Opera does such a great job of this, and LA Philharmonic, and being in just such a happening world like Los Angeles. But the fact of the matter is, like Matthew Coyne stated an hour ago, is that our artistic decisions, like producers, casting agencies, are still primarily run by those who are male, Caucasian, and 55 years or older. And I did include the sources where I got my statistics, so that this is proven data. And that's very interesting because vocal performance majors are being primarily obtained by females, and yet males are in more demand, which of course, if there's less males pursuing degrees, then they're going to be in more demand. However, there is statistics that show that males also receive higher wages in classical music. And this is very interesting as well, considering the diversity statistics of leaders in the classical music and opera world. And you see that very clearly right here. And 9% other ethnicities. That was not very specific in the research that I found. So what does that mean? I even had a hard time finding Latino or Latina leaders in the classical music world. Even in non-classical music, we see so much in pop and mainstream media the rise of Latino and world music, which is so awesome, so awesome. However, why is it that still, even in Spanish-speaking music industry and recording labels, that those leaders are still not representing the diversity of music and the diversity of our nation? So, like I said, I had a hard time finding that in my research. Additionally, it comes to no surprise that composers and conductors alike are, we've seen so much more progress with female composers and those who identify as women who are conductors or composers. We've seen so much progress, which is awesome. But the statistics still show that recently there still is such a disparity between males and females in composition as well as conducting. Even just as recently as 2018 to 2019, 95% of concerts featured compositions by men only, meaning only 5% featured compositions by a female. And the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and pretty much all of those orchestras and the LA Philharmonic, of course, are all such wonderful symphonies and orchestras that I know and love, especially, of course, our next door neighbor, LA Phil. And this in no way is stating that the fact that symphonies or orchestras are still not commissioning as many female composers, it's not at all their fault. This is not at all what I'm saying, that I'm criticizing these orchestras or symphonies. That's not at all what I'm trying to do. I am just merely pointing out the fact of the matter that there is still a disparity of female composers that are being amplified or having a platform. And that is not the fault or the doing of philharmonics or orchestral symphonies. It is probably just the doing that I would like to, in this presentation, I want to discuss why is that? Why is that females, especially women of color, are still maybe not being able to find the avenues to have this, their compositions be, in mainstream classical music or able to get those gigs. Even Chichi Nwanaku, who was the woman who started the first black and minority ethnic orchestra in Europe, she basically stated this as well in her article that she wrote in The Guardian. After attending the BBC proms, where she saw that 29 out of the 160 composers were female, and of those 29 female composers, one was an African American female. So she basically decided to make change. And that's really interesting, considering that if life imitates art and art imitates life, we have such a melting pot of a nation, especially Los Angeles and California, and we should be making artistic decisions that basically reflect the diversity and the representation and reflect the social issues and political issues that go on today in our world, in opera and in classical music. And like I said, I think LA Opera and LA Philharmonic and so many different companies here, especially in Los Angeles, are being basically like pioneers in that, like Red Cat and Beth Morrison and Matthew Coyne, and that's awesome. I just couldn't be prouder of our city. But let's kind of make this movement go around the whole world. So, with my podcast, I kind of hope that this podcast can inspire some of that. So when I say the podcast that encourages women and others to embrace their inner multicultural melody, I mean a few things. So raise your hand if any of you can trace your ancestry or family to different countries. Even if you identify, the world might put you a label as Caucasian, but perhaps you have ancestry from France or, I don't know, Poland. Raise your hand if you can identify with any country, your family, your ancestors, any different cultures, anything other than United States. Yeah, pretty much everyone in this room raised their hand. That's because we are living in such a melting pot of a world, and this world is getting smaller and smaller with technology, that we're all multicultural in a way. And I also argue that we're all musical. Not all of us have musical talents or musical gifts, but music is a part of humanity and a part of the human experience. So we all have that inner melody and that inner multicultural melody. So the way I want to do this is, on my podcast, what I do each week is, each episode I interview women MOCs, which is a term that I coined called musicians of color, and we talk about different things. We talk about music, of course, through the classical and non-classical world, because I do have one woman that I interviewed that's is in the non-classical performing arts world. And we talk about cultural representation, language, social issues, women's empowerment, faith, even career advice for musicians, not just musicians and not just females, but also all professions, because I think that this kinds of advice could apply to all people, even tips on like mental health and physical health. And I think what makes this podcast unique is that a lot of podcasts talk about these topics. However, I'm talking about it through the perspective of female women MOCs. And in this way, this gives the performing arts world a new voice and a new story that is otherwise marginalized or perhaps even neglected by mainstream media. So some questions to consider that basically formulate the entire theme of this conference is, how do we make opera thrive and survive in this world that is technology-based, that is now social media crazed, that, multimedia platforms everywhere, all around us? Do we lose the operatic or performing arts experience? How do we bring audiences with us? Things like that. So, for example, I plan with Notes from Her to use our technological advancements and social media to my advantage. So meaning a lot of people have a phone, a lot of people have a computer, a lot of people listen to podcasts. So therefore we're talking about opera, we're talking about issues that are relevant in today's society and how they pertain to opera and classical music through the perspective of women musicians of color and how it pertains to people of color's issues. And I also have an Instagram, a Twitter, and a Facebook, and that's a platform that kind of amplifies and is able to be shared with the entire world. And in that way, it makes opera thrive and survive. And in this way, it also reinvents and maintains the performing arts and opera experience. Now, of course, with the fact that the times are changing, I think it is very obvious that opera will be changing as well. Our experience with opera may not always be in an opera house. While the opera house experience is the best experience, the fact of the matter is that a lot of people maybe do not have the ability to go to an opera house. So just with a show of hands, how many of you listen to podcasts or radio? Yeah, it's like a growing commodity. How many of you have an Instagram or a Facebook or a Twitter or go on YouTube? Yeah. So you are of the almost 4 million people weekly that download podcasts. And that was a statistic taken in 2017. It is now 2020 and that number has dramatically increased. Especially with social media. Even YouTube and live streaming like we see on Facebook and Instagram, that is one of the main avenues that people around the world are generally receiving and obtaining news and information. And I put print up there because Notes from Her will not only just have a podcast, but it's multimedia, so I hope to have videos. And I also will be publishing a booklet of articles in both English and Spanish that pertain to this subject, so that it can penetrate the English-speaking community, but also the Spanish-speaking community. Additionally, it provides divergences in what I call the new opera. What is the new opera? The new opera is opera and classical music that reflects our modern day society, that is newly composed. Of course, historically, we saw in like Mozart and Brahms and Beethoven's time, the fact that operas and classical music and compositions were just being, composed like nobody's business, because that was the lifestyle. And we see a little less of that now, or the fact that perhaps it's a little harder for composers to get their music out there. So I think that we'll experience a resurgence in that. And then, of course, providing accessibility through podcasting, because like I said, not a lot of people can afford to have the experience of classical music. I know me growing up myself, I wasn't able to afford going to a Broadway show or going to the opera, or, I didn't go see an opera until I was in college and I was in the opera, So opera is expensive, classical music is expensive, and LA Opera does a great job of that as well, where they have, the community circle where they give those tickets to nonprofit organizations and different families. So how do we continue to make opera and classical music accessible to all people? Because music is for everyone. Well, one being that education, class status, finances, or income should not be an obstacle that gets people in the way of experiencing opera or classical music. I understand that experiencing opera in an opera house is the best way to go, but not everyone can get there. Not everyone has a car even. Not everyone has the means or the ability to take a night off from work to go get tickets to see an opera. And I can't tell you how many times people my age have said, I think opera or classical music is cool, but I don't know much about it. Or in low-income high schools or low-income public schools where they're cutting funding for music education. So therefore, that is an issue. But a lot of people have a phone, and a lot of people have different multimedia things at their fingertips, at schools, at work, literally walking around the street, So I implement sound bites onto my podcast episodes of different opera clips from my interviewees. I have some sound bites of some of the women I interviewed singing, some of the women's compositions, and in that way, a person that listens to my podcast that has no idea what classical music or opera is able to hear my podcast episode and say, oh, I know that opera because I'm hearing a little clip of that, you know? So that's pretty cool. And then in that way, erasing elitism in classical arts and opera, because by that way we will break down opera and make it more accessible to all types of people, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, background. And therefore, in my podcast, by interviewing young women of color, we're making opera also more relatable. And of course, raising up the next generation of artists that reflect that multicultural, multifaceted world that these types of people will be inspired to pursue classical music because they saw a woman who looks like them on my podcast. So if if you have any time for questions.
We're out of time, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.